I was never the kind of person to believe in tall tales. Ghost stories, urban legends, they were the sort of thing that kept kids up at night, not me. Growing up in the quiet town of Marlowoug, I heard plenty of stories that were meant to keep us close to home or away from the woods. Most of them were harmless, little bits of folklore about strange noises or odd figures seen from the corner of the eye. But the Bone Riders, well, that one was different. The story of the Bone Riders was an old one, told by the oldest folks around town, usually in hushed tones or over too many beers. According to the legend, they were a gang of spectral horsemen who rode skeletal steeds, drifting in from nowhere and disappearing just as quickly. They never bothered with the living directly. If you saw them, they didn't chase you or scream or do anything outright terrifying. Instead, they had one habit. They'd leave strange bone tracks in the soil, patterns that led into fields, forests, and sometimes nowhere at all. It was said that if you followed those tracks, you'd get taken somewhere else. It wasn't clear where exactly, and no one who supposedly vanished ever returned to tell the tale. I always thought it was a spooky story meant to keep us from wandering too far from town. That is, until the night I saw those tracks myself. It was October, one of those crisp, chilly nights that had settled thickly over the town. I'd stayed late at my friend Leah's place, helping her put together a Halloween display. I remember the way the cool night air seemed to press down as I walked the narrow dirt path leading from her house to mine. It was about a 20-minute walk through mostly empty fields and a few clusters of trees. This late at night, the silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of a branch or the whisper of grass in the wind. About halfway home, something caught my eye. At first, it looked like a set of deep grooves etched into the dirt, winding across the field to my left. I slowed, squinting into the darkness. The grooves looked oddly deliberate, like something had been dragged, but not by human hands. My flashlight picked up long, spindly shapes embedded in the soil, like a trail of thin, dry bones that gleamed faintly in the light. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer to the tracks, crouching down to inspect the brittle remains. The bones weren't scattered haphazardly. They seemed organized in some twisted, precise way. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the trail, at least for a little while. The tracks wound around the edge of the field, deeper into the darkness, and I couldn't help but feel like they were leading me somewhere, tugging me forward with a quiet but unshakable insistence. I told myself I'd only go a little further, just until the field ended. But the trail kept going, pulling me into the woods beyond. As I left the field and stepped into the forest, the night seemed to change. The temperature dropped sharply, the air growing colder with each step. Even the usual sounds of the forest, the chirp of crickets, the occasional rustle of a squirrel, had fallen silent. All I could hear was the faint crunch of leaves underfoot and the brittle, almost fragile snapping of the bone trail I was now fully committed to following. I don't know why I kept going. There was something about that trail that wouldn't let me stop. I felt like I was in a trance, drawn by an invisible force. Every time I tried to turn back, something in me resisted. I couldn't even say what it was. My feet just kept moving, as if they had a will of their own. It wasn't long before I started to notice other signs, little hints that something strange was happening around me. A faint smell, like old dust and decay, drifted on the air, almost sharp enough to sting my nose. Strange shadows stretched along the path, twisting and warping as if lit by a light that didn't exist. After what felt like hours, I reached a small clearing. The bone tracks ended there, circling in a spiral around a twisted, leafless tree in the center. The sight was mesmerizing, and I found myself stepping closer, almost reaching out to touch one of the dark, tangled branches. But then, from somewhere nearby, I heard it, the faintest, almost inaudible sound of hoofbeats. They were soft at first, barely discernible against the night silence. But soon, they grew louder, echoing through the trees, rhythmic and unrelenting. My heart leapt into my throat, and a cold sweat prickled down my spine. I turned, straining to see through the dark, searching for the source of the sound. And that's when I saw them. In the distance, emerging from the shadows of the trees, were figures mounted on skeletal horses. They were barely visible, shrouded in darkness, their hollow forms illuminated only by a faint, unnatural glow. The bone riders, paralyzed with fear, I watched as the figures slowly advanced. They moved with a strange, almost ritualistic grace, each rider sitting perfectly still atop a pale, skeletal horse. The horse's bones clicked and rattled with every step. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was caught in their gaze, or rather, the dark, empty void where their faces should have been. One of the riders, a figure draped in what looked like tattered, ancient robes, raised an arm, gesturing toward me. It was a silent command, one I felt as much as I saw. I could feel an invisible pull, urging me forward, deeper into the clearing. Against my will, my feet began to move. I tried to resist, to force myself to stop, but my body no longer felt like my own. I stumbled forward, each step bringing me closer to the riders. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my vision blurred, but I couldn't stop. They all stood there, silent and motionless, their eyeless faces staring into mine. The smell of decay was overpowering now, filling my lungs with every shallow breath. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. Then, in the dead silence, one of the riders reached out. A single bony hand extended toward me. I didn't dare move. I didn't want to know what would happen. The world around me seemed to dim, the trees fading into shadow, until all that remained were the riders, their skeletal forms looming over me. In that still, suffocating silence, I felt my own heartbeat slow, the rush of terror replaced by a strange, unsettling calm. The rider's hand hung in the air, a cold emptiness emanating from it, inviting, almost begging me to reach out. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I understood that this was no mere encounter. This was an invitation, or perhaps a warning. My hand rose of its own accord, my fingers trembling as they inched closer to the bony grasp. The moment my skin made contact with those frigid bones, a rush of images exploded behind my eyes, scenes that were both foreign and familiar. I saw endless fields under dark skies, shadowed forests filled with ancient, twisted trees. I saw faces, pale, ghostly faces of people I almost recognized, their eyes wide with fear, mouths open in silent screams. And then I saw myself, standing there in that field, surrounded by the bone riders, an eternity stretched out in front of me, a life that would never end, bound to ride with them, trapped in that same hollow, skeletal form. I pulled my hand back, stumbling away, gasping for breath. The rider didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze, watching me, judging me. It was as if I'd passed some kind of test, one I hadn't known I was taking. The riders watched me with that eerie, hollow silence, as though they were waiting for something else. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing, the night pressing heavily around me. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd escaped whatever fate they intended. But as I turned to back away, my eyes caught something on my arm, a faint, pale mark left where the rider had touched me. It was a thin, almost imperceptible line, like a scar or scratch, glowing softly in the darkness. Panic gripped me. I tried to rub it off, scratching until my skin was raw, but it remained, undisturbed, chillingly permanent. The riders made no move toward me, yet I felt their presence more acutely than ever, a relentless weight bearing down on me. One rider tilted its head, a slight, deliberate motion that sent a fresh wave of fear through my veins. Then, with a silent command, the entire group turned and began to retreat, disappearing one by one into the dense forest. Their skeletal figures faded into the shadows until only the faintest glow of bone remained. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. I stood alone in the clearing, feeling the cold emptiness left in their wake. My heart hammered as I backed away, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and the place where I'd seen those ghostly figures. But that faint mark on my arm continued to glow, a haunting reminder of my encounter. I didn't run, not immediately. Something in me knew that running would only make things worse, as if it would somehow draw them back. So I walked, each step slow and deliberate, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement, every crackle of a branch or rustle of a leaf making me jump. I kept glancing down at the mark, hoping it would fade, but it remained, stubbornly bright. When I finally made it home, I locked the door behind me, bolting every latch. The silence of my own house felt surreal, almost dreamlike, after the strange, otherworldly encounter in the woods. I spent the rest of the night staring at that mark, unable to look away, as if it held a power over me. The next morning brought little comfort. The mark was still there, faint but visible, like an imprint left on my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that a part of me had been left in that clearing with the riders. It wasn't just a sense of dread. It was a deep, bone-chilling fear that gnawed at my mind. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, lingering just long enough to make my skin prickle with unease. I'd hear faint hoofbeats at night, soft and distant, like an echo from a memory I'd rather forget. My dreams grew dark, filled with images of those hollow eyes and skeletal horses, chasing me through endless forests. One night, a tapping sound woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I sat up, I realized it was too deliberate, too steady. It was coming from my window. I forced myself to look, my heart racing. Outside, barely visible against the darkness, was a shape, a rider motionless, watching me. I didn't dare move. It wasn't like seeing a ghost. It was something far worse, as though my soul itself was under threat. The rider's hollow face seemed to bore into me, and though it stood outside, I felt its presence as if it were right beside me. I was paralyzed, unable to look away, until the tapping stopped and the figure melted into the night. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep pretending that it was all in my head. The bone riders were real, and whatever mark I carried seemed to tether me to them, drawing them closer with every passing day. I decided to leave town, hoping that putting miles between us would free me from their grasp. I packed little I needed, leaving under cover of dawn when the world was just beginning to wake. But as I drove down the winding roads leading away from Marlowood, a chilling sensation settled over me, a feeling that I hadn't escaped at all. It happened just as I turned onto a narrow road leading toward the highway. Out of nowhere, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring everything in front of me. The trees on either side grew faint and ghostly, like twisted shadows lurking in the mist. I slowed, peering through the windshield, straining to see. Then I heard it, the faint sound of hoofbeats, growing louder and louder until it seemed they were right beside me. My hands tightened on the wheel as my heart pounded, dread pooling in my stomach. In the rearview mirror, the dark forms of riders began to materialize, their skeletal figures barely visible through the fog. They rode alongside my car, their empty eyes fixed on me, as though they'd been waiting, knowing I'd try to run. A single rider pulled ahead, blocking the road. My foot slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt. Panic clawed at my throat as I watched the rider slowly approach. Its skeletal hand reached out, beckoning me once more, as it had in the clearing. This time, I felt an overwhelming sense of resignation, as if some deep part of me knew there was no escape. The mark on my arm burned, and I felt a strange pull, as if I were tethered to them, bound by something more powerful than I could comprehend. I opened the door, stepping out into the mist. The bone rider watched, its hand still extended, waiting for me to accept. As I reached out, touching that cold, empty grasp, the fog seemed to close in around us, swallowing the road, the trees, and the last remnants of daylight. In that final moment, as the world around me faded, I felt an eerie calm settle over me. The riders had chosen me, and I had answered their call.